Suffering from dry, tired, irritated eyes? Don't let dry eyes win. Use Sustain Pro. It hydrates, restores, and protects dry eyes for up to 12 hours. Sustain Pro. Triple action dry eye relief.
Hi, and welcome to Kay Let's Talk, the podcast where we break down storytelling across books, television, and film with a special love for book-to-screen adaptations. Here, we talk about craft, character arcs, structure, dialogue, visual language, and the creative choices that shape how a story lands. If you like thoughtful conversational deep dives into the stories you can't stop thinking about, you're in the right place. Let's talk. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. It's been a while since I sat down to record. I went on a little trip to Europe and took some time off. I'm excited to get back, press the record button, and talk to you guys about some hockey-related questions that I got as it pertains to the show Heated Rivalry. So today, that's what we're going to discuss. I'm going to tackle a couple of these questions. I've already talked about hockey in some capacity in other Q&A videos. So if you haven't listened to the previous Q&A videos, be sure to go back and listen to those. There are some hockey-related questions that I answer in them. But this particular episode will cover specifically hockey questions that I got asked over on Instagram and also on TikTok and Threads. As always, if you have any questions about the show that you want me to cover in a future Q&A episode, please feel free to send me a message on any of my socials. I love getting to chat to people in the DMs, and usually I have a conversation with whoever's asking me the question prior to picking that question out and putting it into my format for these long form recordings. So please drop any that you might have over on my socials. I look forward to reading all of them and talking about them in these episodes. And without further ado, let's get into the hockey specific questions as it pertains to Heated Rivalry. In my last Q&A video, I talked about the cap and how that works with hockey players' salaries and the teams and how they pay their players, and specifically how that relates to Shane and Ilya and how their salaries are going to change once they both play on the same team. And since they're both star players, how does the team figure out what they pay them? All of those details. So if that's a question you want an answer for, go back and listen to my previous Q&A video and you can hear my explanation for that in there. The first question I have for this recording is, why do NHL players share hotel rooms? Is that normal? And that's because in the show, it depicts that Shane and Hayden are sharing a hotel room. And truthfully, that no longer happens in the NHL. And that's because of a collective bargaining agreement that happened back in 2013, where the NHLPA, which is the National Hockey League Players Association, they had mapped out an agreed upon updated version of the collective bargaining agreement with the league and its players, which you can find online if you're curious to read about it. But in the 2013 agreement, it stated that any player on an SPC who is not in the entry-level system shall be entitled to a single room accommodation for all club road trips. So to break that down further, that means that the player has to be on an SPC, which means standard player contract, and the player cannot be in the entry-level system, meaning they have to have an NHL contract. So if the player normally plays in the AHL, which is the league beneath the NHL, and gets called up to an NHL game, but they aren't playing on an NHL contract for that game, they're still on their two-way contract between the AHL and the NHL, they would not be required to get a single room while on the road. And a two-way NHL contract pays a player a different salary depending on whether they're playing up in an NHL game or in a minor league game. And the player would receive a higher salary for an NHL game and a lower one, obviously, for the minor league game. So that's common for a lot of the developing players. And the reason for those types of contracts is it provides the team with a little more flexibility to manage their salary cap and their roster, like I mentioned when we talked about the salary cap question. But hopefully that answers your question about sharing the hotel rooms. That wouldn't happen for a team or a player rather, that has a NHL contract. They would be getting their own room on the road. So that is an inaccuracy in Heated Rivalry post 2013 in the timeline. So keep that in mind. Shane and Hayden would not be sharing a room. The next question is, why are fights a part of the game? And I got that in many iterations, a few different ways, but the gist of the question was, why is there fighting in hockey? And fighting, transparently, has been a very big part of the game since the league was created in 1917. And I would say it's almost entirely ingrained into the sport because of the blue-collar nature of hockey and its association with being a tough physical sport. And a lot of the time, the fighting is being framed as a form of self-policing for the players. So if players believe that there's a dangerous play or someone's playing dirty, that sort of threat of a fight can sometimes keep the game a little bit more safe for the star players who do not engage in those types of scrums. And for a long time, it was kind of believed that if the opposing team knew that there was a player or an enforcer on your team that would hit you or fight you if you threw a dirty hit or took a cheap shot on one of their star players, then you're less likely to take those liberties with the skilled guys. And the second reason for the fighting, and I would argue this is probably the bigger reason, is that it creates a very big momentum shift within a game. It gets the crowd and the benches excited and energized if you see someone sticking up for a teammate with a fight. And recently, there's been more rule changes and criticisms of the fighting. So it has died down quite a lot. And we see that it comes back more often in the playoffs because the emotions are running really high during the playoffs. But the game as a whole is much more focused on speed and skill nowadays. So the need for fighting is no longer as valued or necessary. And I would say that some fans are not thrilled with that, but it does remain part of the game because I think it's maintaining the tradition and fan service that often comes with, people seeing a fight in person. And in the book series, players like Ryan Price, he's an enforcer. So his entire career would have been built around his ability to fight and protect the star players on his team. But that doesn't happen as often anymore. Players nowadays are expected to be able to be skilled. And you do have players and guys who are on the fourth lines who are physical and tough, but they also are talented. So they can be involved in fights and scrums, but they're also expected to produce points and put numbers on the board. So there's far less Ryan Price-like players in the league now, and fighting is not as prevalent, I would say, but it is still very much a part of the game. I think it always will be, and I would argue that the main reason for it is for those momentum swings that I talked about. It can really change the speed of the game and the emotion of a game and tilt the ice in one way or another for a team. So if you're losing and you want to get energy up on your bench, someone might drop the gloves with somebody just to get the crowd going and get the energy in the rink back up again. Piggybacking off of that question, the next one is, are chirps and fighting necessary or legal? And I would say yes, both are legal, and I would argue necessary. It's very much a part of the game culturally, again, like the fighting. And yes, you're allowed to chirp. It happens all game long. The fighting occurs oftentimes when, a player is fed up with another player, or again, just if two guys know each other and they know that the other player has a reputation for dropping the gloves and is willing to fight, sometimes they'll tap them at a face-off and say, hey, you want to go? And they'll just drop the gloves right away and start the game off with a fight or start the period off with a fight. So we saw that in the Four Nations tournament last year. That was a perfect example of, a player just dropping the gloves for a momentum swing at the start of the game. So yeah, I don't want to say it's necessary, but it's used for a very specific reason, which is a momentum swing. And just to explain the rules of fighting, because I think that sometimes it can be confusing how that works. So technically speaking, a fighting penalty would be when a player repeatedly punches or attempts to punch an opponent, when two players grapple in a way that prevents the officials from being able to separate them. So they have their arms on one another and the referees can't separate the two of them. Most of the time when they're assessing penalties, they'll have to figure out each player that was involved in the fight, who started it and who continued it. And oftentimes the player that's been labeled as the aggressor, or the person who, continues throwing punches even after the other player is no longer fighting back, they're deemed as the winner. And they both will receive a 5-minute major penalty, or sometimes there's a game misconduct if the player goes beyond that necessary threshold, I would say. So that's kind of where the line is crossed, is sometimes there can be additional penalties or misconduct penalties if the instigator does more than they need to after they've clearly already won the fight. During a fight, anyone who's not partaking in the fight, they have to skate away or, go near a bench, particularly their own bench. So in the show, we saw that when Shane gets hurt, you can hear the ref saying, "Go back to your bench." That's very common. If something's happening, they usually try and get the other players that aren't partaking in it to clear the area and go back to their bench area. And sometimes if you don't do that, you can get your own penalty for not listening. The goalies also have to stay in their creases. So there's also been goalie fights. So when the goalies leave their crease or cross over the red line of the center of the ice, they can get penalties too. The other instance where the player might receive a misconduct or a game misconduct would be if the player continues or tries to continue fighting after being ordered to stop by the refs. So sometimes the refs will put an end to the fight even if there's no clear winner, and they'll intervene and break it up. If the player then continues to fight after that point, they can be issued another penalty. So oftentimes that will end up in a misconduct. So the chirping, the reason why that's relevant is that being good at chirping, not only is it a point of pride, but there's a line that a lot of these players kind of ride. And it happens in women's hockey too. I was never personally good at chirping, but it's an effective way to get a rise out of players you're matched up against with all game. So it happens at the face-off dots. It also happens in the corners. It happens between the goalie and the forwards on the other team. It happens with defensemen who are defending in front of the net with all the forwards. So they're matched up with forwards all game. And it's funny and fun at times, but it is also mainly used to draw penalties and get emotions out of the other players so that they'll make mistakes. And so in that sense, yeah, chirping's pretty necessary, and it's very much a part of the game for sure. The next question was kind of a broad statement, but what is the Prospect Cup? And interestingly, if you don't already know this, in the show, it's called the Prospect Cup, but in actuality, it's the World Junior Tournament. And so the World Junior Ice Hockey Championships is what it's technically called. It's a tournament hosted by the International Ice Hockey Federation, and it happens every year. It takes place at the end of December into early January, and it's where the best players from all of the qualified teams play against each other in this really big tournament. A lot of those teams you'll recognize: Sweden, Finland, Canada, the US, of course, Germany, Switzerland, Czechia, Slovakia. I want to say there are a few other maybe Kazakhstan teams, and obviously Russia, but Russia is currently not permitted to participate, and they haven't been since 2022. But the tournament is largely used as sort of another form of a tryout for players that are hoping to make an NHL team or to get drafted, because the players participating in the tournament must be under 20 years old. And that is the age group 18 to 20 of amateur players that are able to take part in the NHL draft. In regards to the Prospect Cup in the show and also in, real life, there is a big emphasis on Canada and Russia's rivalry because in large part, the NHL players for a long time were not able to compete in the Olympics. So this tournament was one of the very few opportunities that a Canadian player or a US player would have the opportunity to play against the Soviets for a long time. So Canada and Russia. They're the two teams that have won the most titles in the history of the World Junior Tournament. So that rivalry between them continues and is very, very real. So that depiction is very, very accurate. And specifically, I remember in the show, Ilya's father talks about having to beat Shane and Canada. That would be stemming again from this long-standing rivalry between the two countries in this specific tournament. The next question was, what is the draft? So I'm, again, simplifying this quite a lot, but hopefully it will be easy to understand and follow. So the NHL draft is a draft where amateur players who are between the ages of 18 and 20 are able to submit through paperwork that they declare that they want to try and make an NHL team and allow an NHL team to acquire the rights to sign them to a professional contract. So they have to enter the draft. They have to be over 18, under 20, and fill out paperwork, submit it by a deadline. And all of the NHL teams have scouts that go out all over the world to watch games. They find talent when they're younger, they track their performance, they evaluate them heavily, and they go to all of these other major leagues that can include ones in Europe and also in North America. There's leagues in Canada and the US that these junior players would play in. They also look at players in college teams who, instead of playing in these juniors, they can go to NCAA and play college. Or the USHL is another avenue that a lot of people in North America take. In Canada, it's, like the OHL, the WHL, the Q. There's all these different leagues. So scouts will watch those players either in person or via game footage now, because a lot of these games are streamed online. And they'll kind of figure out who they like and keep tabs on those kids so that they'll go into their development system and hopefully one day make the NHL team, because each NHL team has feeder teams beneath it. So they have an AHL team and then they have a ECHL team, and they're all connected and in the same system. So you can move up within those two leagues and hopefully make the NHL team, which is, the pinnacle. Or you could stay in their development program and be in the ECHL version or the AHL version of that same program. Being drafted doesn't automatically mean that you're going to play in the NHL. They might, if they're good enough, go straight to the NHL. That usually happens for people who are the top picks, which in the show would be Shane and Ilya, who went number 1 and 2 overall. But a lot of them might go to the AHL, which is the minor league, or they could choose to stay in college or in their current league that they're playing in. And then the NHL team would decide when they're ready to join one of their affiliate teams or bump up into the NHL. So it's all based on that specific player's development needs. So a player can be drafted, but then they can also not get offered a formal contract or get signed to one. And if that happens, then they can choose to re-enter the draft again or sign later on as a free agent. So they're not obligated to sign to one team if they're a free agent. They can kind of shop around to other teams. And like I said before, in order to be eligible, the North American players, they can enter into the draft between ages 18 and 20. European players, it's a little different. In terms of the actual draft day itself, you don't have to be there in person, but there are 7 rounds total. The total number of players, I think, is like 224 or 225, and it takes a few days. And most of the time, the guys that are going in the top rounds are the ones that actually attend and sit in the audience. Because teams have large systems of players spread out between the NHL, the AHL, and their other leagues like the ECHL, they're constantly trying to find and develop talent and move players up and down as needed. And so that's kind of good to remember that just because you're drafted doesn't mean you're going to start playing in the NHL right away. That's actually very, very rare. So again, when we're talking about it in terms of heated rivalry, the fact that Shane and Ilya both were drafted number 1 and 2 overall and then played the next season, that's just a sign again of how good they are. That doesn't happen all the time. It does usually with the first round draft picks. A lot of them will go right away, but again, not all. It's really, really hard to do that. The other thing to keep in mind that I think is relevant to the show is that Shane and Ilya being chosen number 1 and number 2 overall, that's in large part because of the draft order. So the teams are all given a order or a number in which they get to pick a player. And the order of the draft is based on the inverse of the regular season standings. So basically the worst teams get to pick earlier in the draft. And they do this by using a draft lottery. And that makes sure that teams don't purposely try to lose in order to get a first round pick. But in the case of the show, it does mean that Boston and Montreal had terrible seasons before Shane and Ilya were drafted, and that's what put them in positions to have the first and second overall picks. And so that draft lottery includes all of the teams who did not make the playoffs. So just because you come in last place, that doesn't automatically give you the first round draft pick. All of those teams enter into a lottery, and then the lottery selects who gets the first, second, third, fourth pick. And there's a lot more rules within this, but I won't overcomplicate things. Hopefully this gives you a pretty good idea of how the draft works. The next question, again, piggybacking off this concept, is what do the NHL playoffs look like? Which we see them come up quite a bit in the show. So just to simplify things, there are 16 teams that qualify to play in the Stanley Cup Playoffs. In the show, it's called the MLH Cup. And the format of it is bracket style. Brackets that are division-based, and then there are wild card teams. So the top 3 teams in each division will make up the first 12 teams in the playoffs, and then the remaining 4 spots are filled with the next 2 highest placed finishers in each conference, which are considered wild cards, and that's based on regular season records regardless of the division that they're in. So it's possible for one division in each conference to send 5 teams to the postseason, while another might just send 3 of their teams to the postseason. The position you get put in for the brackets gives you home ice advantage for the first 2 rounds of the Stanley Cup playoffs. So the team that gets placed higher at the end of the regular season, they will often get home ice advantage. And each of the 4 rounds of the playoffs is a best of 7. So the first team to win 4 games advances to the next round. In the first round of the playoffs, the division winner with the best record in each of those conferences will be matched against the wildcard team, which is the one with the lesser record. And the wildcard team with the better record will play the other division winner. Hopefully that makes sense. The teams finishing second and third in each division meet within the bracket by heading off against their respective division winners. And then as we move through the rounds, the second round sees the first round winners within each bracket play one another to determine the 4 teams that will participate in the conference finals. So that takes place before the Stanley Cup final. So in the conference final and the Stanley Cup final, the home ice advantage goes to the team that had the better regular season record, regardless of the team's standing in their division. So your regular season record comes into play quite a bit in the playoffs, and they use it as you move through each of the rounds. And again, each round that you go in, it's a best of 7 series. Sometimes almost all of these series will go to a game 7. And so that's a lot of hockey that these teams play in the postseason. Everyone plays hurt. It's really a grind. They get 2 days off in between games. Sometimes you can have a team that's playing a team on the other side of the country. So there's a lot of travel time involved. So it's really, really strenuous on the players. Really intense, really fun, really fast, very emotional. If you've never watched playoff hockey and you're trying to get into hockey, I would highly encourage you to watch it this spring. It's going to be starting very soon. and it's really fun hockey to watch. The next question is, how is women's hockey different from men's hockey? Is there as much fighting? So keep in mind that depending on where the games are being held, the rules can change. So for example, the PWHL has different rules than the ones we saw in the Olympics. And the same can be said for the NHL. The NHL has different rules than the Olympic Games rules that were implemented for the men as well. But I would say the biggest difference between the two is that fighting and the body checking, which are not allowed in women's hockey. It's starting to shift in the PWHL, and it will trickle down into the lower levels like the college game, some of the club teams, and high school levels. But a lot of them are still operating under different rules than the PWHL. And the big difference with that is that women did not grow up learning how to check when playing hockey like the men do. The men's side, they learn when they're younger so that they know how to give and take a hit. And the women, they didn't do that. So hopefully as they move forward now with the youth teams, that will change. The other difference for the pro level is that women wear full face masks and men do not. So women will wear cages or bubbles to protect their faces, and the men usually wear the half shields. I would say culturally they're pretty similar. I don't want to get too in the weeds about that because my particular experience is probably going to be different than a women's player playing in a different state or in another country. But on the whole, I would say that most of the differences are regarding the rules, and even that is changing rapidly on the women's side. So moving forward, it'll be interesting to see what else changes for the women's game. The next question I got is, how did hockey get popular in warmer climates? And I thought this was an interesting one, but also super relevant. A lot of that was actually due to the NHL itself pushing for the expansion of the league in the 90s and the decision to put new teams into warmer climates. So in the 90s, we saw teams pop up in Florida and Arizona. And then in 2017, we got Vegas. We also have Dallas that showed up in the 90s. So when those teams showed up in those areas and those markets, it led to a lot more people learning about the sport, and there was more interest. So there were rinks being built and more programs popping up in those places. And so the game was able to grow, and kids watching the games in their areas wanted to learn how to play. So it naturally took off. It took, a long time from the 90s until now for us to see the trickle down effect of that. But now there are players from all over the country who play hockey, and some of them are in the NHL. Captain of Toronto is from Arizona. So a lot of the teams before and players were contained to much of the Northeast, or, states like Minnesota, Michigan, all those hockey hotbed places, and then obviously Canada. So the NHL is responsible for hockey getting popular in warmer climates, and the push for the expansion of the league in the 90s and making the markets in the South a priority for them has really helped to grow the game. The next question is, I'm desperate to know what the spitting on the bench is all about. And I thought that would be a fun question to end this podcast episode on. So I would say, and this is my personal experience and take on this, but hockey players spit on the bench quite a bit on the men's side. I can say for myself, I didn't spit really on the bench, and much of my teammates didn't spit on the bench. But when you are playing hockey, it is a lot of cardio. You are mouth breathing in a cold rink, and the air can be dry. You're also wearing a mouth guard. There is a lot of spit that can, end up being a factor. But I would say on the whole, I would compare it to baseball players who spit sunflower seeds. It's more of like a habit that becomes heavily used by players, I would say. I more often would rinse my mouth out with the water bottles and squirt my water bottle like Shane does in the show, even though he did it incorrectly in the show. And I actually had commented on someone's post, and the guy, one of the hockey players who helped out on the show to teach Hudson and Connor kind of the little tricks of the trade of mannerisms for hockey players, he confirmed what I suspected, which is when Shane is leaning against the boards talking to Hayden in episode 5, he squirts the water into his mouth and then he squirts the water onto the ice. And it should have been the inverse. He should have squirted the water onto the ice first and then squirted the water into his mouth. And I had commented on this thread and said that in large part, I would do that because the water bottles, the caps on them are plastic and they get thrown around on the bench all the time and they break. And so a lot of them, the water coming out of the nozzle at the top would not squirt straight and you would get it all over your face or all over your jersey or all down the front of your equipment. So I would check the cap of the water bottle before I squirted it into my mouth to make sure that it was going to come out in like a steady stream. So a lot of people will do that. They'll squirt it first before they put it in their mouth. And in the show, Hudson squirts it in his mouth and then squirts it onto the ice. So I think he was meant to do the inverse. And then the guy, the hockey player who had actually helped out, consulted on the show, confirmed that I was right. So that was kind of a funny detail. But yeah, I would say on the men's side, think of the spitting on the bench like baseball players with sunflower seeds. It's just like a habitual nervous energy thing and a force of habit, I would say. A gross one, but definitely a force of habit. As with smelling salts, if you watch a NHL game, most of the time at the beginning of the game or at the start of the second and third periods, they'll put the camera on the benches and a lot of those guys will do smelling salts. So there's a lot of little things like that that if you watch enough hockey, you'll pick up on. And if you play hockey, you pick up on too, because, you know, you'll have a teammate who does something and you might give it a try. And if you're superstitious, you'll continue doing it. Like I put all my equipment on my right side first and then my left. So my right skate on first, then my left, and I tie my right skate first, then my left. Everyone has their own little things. I would say spitting is just like one of those cultural things. Like everyone on the bench does it, so you just kind of join in. And that happens with a lot of those little nuancy details that I think the show did a good job trying to include. So I'm going to end there. Hopefully this answers some of the hockey-related questions that people had. And if you have any more hockey-related questions, please let me know. I love talking about them. There's not a lot of hockey in the show, obviously, but what they do show is pretty insightful. And there is a lot of subtext within the hockey that, you know, if people are curious, I love talking about it because it is relevant to the character development and it's going to become even more important in season 2. So hopefully the show makes some hockey fans out of people and you'll watch the playoffs, and then going into season 2, you'll have a better idea of what's going on with the players and what they're facing. As always, if you made it this far into the episode, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. And I will be back soon with another episode. Let me know if you have any topics you want me to cover. I've already got a good chunk of them lined up for our next installment. And I look forward to receiving more from people who are following along with the podcast. So I will chat with you all soon.